The executor described her as the calmest person he ever hanged, perhaps just as calm as when she was seen transferring 2 bodies crammed in a bloody pram in the streets of London. One body was her lover's wife, and the other his 18-month-old daughter. Until her dying breath, Mary Pearcey proclaimed her innocence, and her last wish still puzzles to this day. If you enjoy content like this, please consider subscribing to my channel, and if you enjoy the video, please hit the like button to help me produce more videos like this one. Let's get into a story. Mary Pearcey was born Mary Eleanor Wheeler on March 26 of 1866 in the town of Kent in England, but everyone knew her as Nellie. She grew in a loving family, and she was the first daughter of Frank and Charlotte Wheeler. Her mother always described her as a compassionate child, one who would do anything for others, but also a painfully sensitive one and self-destructive. As a child, Mary suffered from constant epileptic seizures and depression, conditions she inherited from her mother, but a fall on the ground that impacted her head when she was a toddler made the seizures much worse, and since then she suffered with severe headaches. Mary left school in her late teens and went to work for her uncle's newsagent, and then she went to work as a childminder for an infant at a neighbor's house. Her seizures were getting so much worse to the point where they had to let her go in the fear of their child's safety. These events made her very miserable, and a month later she received another major blow in life, where her father died suddenly after being injured at work, and her mother was committed to an asylum from grief. All these were too much for teenage Mary to handle emotionally, and was said that she fell into a deep depression that she couldn't get out of. Around that time, Mary met a man called John Pearcey, a local carpenter by trade, and they moved in together. Although the pair never married, Mary took his last name and kept it until her death, for unknown reasons. John was caring and faithful to her, but Mary was not. Her string of affairs made John to eventually pack up his things and leave her. Some accounts mention that Mary spent much of her time in the company of wealthy men, using them to live a comfortable and work-free life, whereas others sustain that Mary was a hard-working woman. But one fact agreed upon is that Mary had an effect on men. One of the men her charm allured was Frank Hogg, a furniture remover. Mary fell madly in love with Frank to the point she was obsessed, but she was not the only one in his life. He was also dating others, including a woman called Phoebe Styles, and it wasn't long before Frank confessed to Mary that Phoebe fell pregnant with his child, and he intended to do the right thing and marry her. Upon hearing the news, Mary became paranoid. She knew she was going to lose the man she dreamed a future with. As a desperate last resort, she wrote Frank various letters before his marriage, maintaining that she could not live without him, and that she would die if her only friend left her, and that he had more power over her than anyone on earth. In one letter she wrote that she was willing to do anything so she wouldn't lose him, including becoming friends with his future wife, only if Frank promised that they would remain lovers, and Frank agreed. The marriage took place on November 22nd of 1888, when Phoebe was just 3 months pregnant. She gave birth to a baby girl in the summer of 1889, and they named her Phoebe Hannalope, but everyone called her Tiggy. In the meantime, Frank kept his part of the promise, and Mary kept hers. Over the next 2 years, Phoebe continued to be friends with Mary, and if we take Frank's word, he and his wife often met with Mary and they all hung out together, and that Phoebe never minded her husband visiting Mary alone. He further claimed that Phoebe never knew of the affair, nor that she ever suspected anything. Weeks before the murders took place, 32-year-old Phoebe fell seriously ill, and it was alleged that Mary was there for her, trying to nurse her back into health. But the good-natured actions of Mary would eventually take a dangerous extent. At around 4 p.m. on Friday, October 24th, Mary's neighbor heard the sounds of violence, a child screaming as if in pain, and sounds of a breaking glass coming from Mary's house. Worried that something serious might have happened, she checked over the fence and saw that the windows were covered with dark fabric. She then called Mary's name to check if everything is okay, but the neighbor received no reply, and then silence. 7 p.m. of the same evening, a man was walking home from work when he discovered a well-dressed woman lying on the sidewalk. Initially, he thought she was strung and passed out, but when he approached her, to his horror, he found that her head was lying in a pool of blood, so he immediately went to the authorities. The woman's head was wrapped in a man's sleeveless cardigan, but when police removed it, they were confronted with the face of a woman covered in blood, and she had a very deep slash in her throat. It was later determined that her throat was so violently cut that it nearly severed the head. The victim also had a fractured skull from apparent blows in the head, assumed to derive from a penetrating instrument like an axe. No identification of the body could be made, but authorities came into two conclusions. One, it was very apparent that the murder occurred elsewhere, based on the extent of the injuries the woman sustained and the lack of a large amount of blood where the body was found. And two, a bloody pram was recovered close to the scene an hour after the body was found, and was thought to be the device the murderer used to carry the body at that location. The next morning, the small body of a baby girl was discovered and was determined to have died from suffocation. It was later theorized that the baby was either suffocated before or right after her mother's murder, or that the murderer placed her mother's deceased body on top of her and the baby suffocated due to lack of air. On the early morning of the fateful Friday, Frank Hogg had left home for work. When he returned to an empty house that evening, his sister Clara informed him that Phoebe left with their daughter at around 3:15 p.m. and mentioned that she wouldn't be long. Her extended absence late at night prompted Frank to assume that Phoebe went to visit her father, who was ill, and stayed overnight. He woke up the next morning, went to work, but when he came back for breakfast, he was greeted by his landlady, who informed him of the news she read in the paper about the horrific murder that had occurred the previous day. Both Frank and Clara began to panic and went to report Phoebe as missing, and then Frank sent his sister to Mary's house to check if she saw his wife at all the previous day. Mary initially denied Phoebe was ever there, but after Clara pressured her, she admitted that Phoebe came by asking for money and then asked Mary not to tell anyone that she was there. Both women then went to the morgue. Mary's behavior thereafter was stated as very bizarre. She was initially trying to prevent Clara from identifying the body by assuring her that it was not Phoebe, and when the body was revealed, she started yelling hysterically at the horrific sight. But when Clara positively identified the body, confirming that it was Phoebe's and that the bloody pram belonged to little Tiggy, the police started to gather pieces of a very suspicious puzzle together. As it seemed, Mary was the last known person to have seen Phoebe alive, because as it became apparent on the morning of October 24, 1890, Mary sent a note to Phoebe Hogg inviting her for tea at her home at 2 Priory Street in London. Witnesses also stated that they saw Mary on the night of the murder, wheeling a pram in a casual manner with, quote, a large object sticking out, end quote. Police also uncovered the affair she was having with the victim's husband. All this prompted the authorities to pay a visit to Mary's house, and their suspicions were confirmed. Blood spatter covered the kitchen walls and several items of clothing, including the fabric used to conceal the windows, and they found a carving knife and a fireplace poker covered in blood. With that, we can assume that she either didn't have ample time to conceal her crimes properly, or that she just wasn't as concerned. Mary's behavior during the house search was even more disturbing. She very calmly sat on the piano playing tunes and humming, and when they questioned her about the bloody stains, she said, quote, I was having problem with mice and was trying to kill them, and then started chanting, 'Killing mice, killing mice.' When brought to the station for further questioning, they also discovered scratches on Mary's hands, as well as Phoebe's wedding ring on her finger. She was then charged with murder. Mary was put on trial at the Old Bailey Central Criminal Court by the same judge who tried Kate Webster 11 years prior, another case I previously covered. Mary pleaded not guilty to the charge. Although the exact events that drove Mary over the edge were never revealed, the motive for her violent actions was considered to be uncontrollable jealousy. It was thought that she murdered Phoebe Hogg in a fit of passion and rage, possibly after revealing the affair she had with Frank, followed by an altercation between the women, but I suppose we will never know the exact events. To prove the motive, the prosecution brought as evidence all the letters Mary had written to Frank to try and convince the court of her obsessiveness and that ultimately she couldn't share him with anyone else. Witnesses were also brought in who testified seeing Mary wheeling the pram at the night of the murder, as well as the neighbor who heard violent noises and screaming from Mary's house. Her very strange behavior at the morgue and during the police house search didn't side with her either. John Pearcey, Mary's former living boyfriend, testified, providing verification that the cardigan Phoebe's head was wrapped in was in fact his, and he left it at the house when he broke off their relationship. No premeditation could be successfully argued by the prosecution, as Mary did not do a thorough job to cover her involvement after the fact. The only debatable fact for this matter was that she did invite Phoebe for tea and that the windows were covered with dark fabric, but we cannot be sure if that was the case or if she simply snapped. Mary's defense argued against the evidence presented by the prosecution to link Mary to the crime, stating that these were circumstantial, and they further claimed that Mary's physical strength would be impossible to allow her to carry out murders of this magnitude. Once the two sides rested the case, Mary was found guilty and sentenced to death. Following the guilty verdict, her defense team tried effortlessly to convince her to plead insanity, so as to try and pin the facts on seizure episodes. Mary vehemently denied to plead insanity, and she was awaiting for her execution. Until her dying breath, Marypearcey sustained that she was innocent. Her execution took place on the 23rd of December of 1890 at Newgate Prison, where the executor described her as the calmest person he ever hanged. In fact, the only time she was reported to have lost her composure was when she requested for Frank Hogg to visit her one last time, but he never showed up. She was seemingly inconsolable the day of the visitation, but after that she remained emotionless and accepted her fate until her death. Frank Hogg disappeared after the trial. No one knows what happened to him, nor if he left the country, but evidently Madame Tussauds purchased some items from the murder from him, including his daughter's pram, so perhaps he used the money to escape the whole situation. But the biggest enigma in this case was Mary's last wish. The night prior to her execution, Mary asked her solicitor to place an advertisement in the Spanish newspaper with the following words: "To MECP, last wish of MEW, have not betrayed." She never offered an explanation for the meaning of the cryptic code, nor to whom she was referring to. MEW is assumed to stand for Mary Eleanor Wheeler, her actual full name. Based on the speculations regarding the initials MECP and their correlation to the 4 of Jack the Ripper's victims, as you can see on your screens, as well as the period the crime was committed, and the fact that she killed Phoebe in such a violent manner, Mary was brought up as a Jill the Ripper suspect. But to be very honest with you, I personally do not think she's a good candidate at all. If she did want a forever life with Frank, she would have done a better job concealing her crimes and cleaning after the fact. Jack the Ripper very successfully managed to elude authorities, so they knew how to do so. Mary also covered Phoebe's head, which could be argued that it signified care for the victim, or even shame for the crime. And lastly, it is not documented anywhere about Mary's knowledge of anatomy. But questions still will stand as to whom she was referring to in the mysterious ad. Perhaps there was an accomplice or someone else who committed the actual murder and she was covering for him and who perhaps then fled to Spain. Perhaps her defense had a good point that she could not commit the murders by herself, but I suppose we will never know. Until next time.